Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness. Places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Whisper in the Sump. I'd been driving since before daylight, winding the switchbacks with the Blue Ridge falling away below me in grey folds. The map had shown a narrow sump at the far end of the cave, nothing more than a quick belly crawl through a shallow lens of water. I'd told myself it was just one more tight spot like I'd done before, nothing worth turning back for. The road had been long and the directions vague, and by the time I pulled off onto the old logging cut, I was committed. The air outside smelled of leaves crushed damp into the soil, and I could hear the steady hiss of a creek somewhere below the ridge. The entrance yawned low in the bank, not much higher than my waist, ringed with the kind of roots that looked like they'd been trying to crawl away for decades. I checked my gear, cinched my helmet, and stepped into the dark. It was a relief at first. The cool, steady temperature wrapping around me after the heavy heat outside. My light cut across smooth limestone and tiny threads of water curling down the walls. The floor dropped in gradual steps, each slick with clay. I moved deeper, the ceiling lowering until my knees ached from the crawl. The sump appeared just as the map had promised. A still pool, tea-colored, reflecting my beam like a flat coin. The surface was so still that for a moment I wondered if it was solid. I lay down, pushing forward on my belly, helmet scraping above me, chest pressing into the cold water. The squeeze was tighter than I expected, my ribs brushing rock. The taste of the water filled my mouth from the damp air alone, metallic and old. Breaking through to the other side, I lifted my head into a small chamber where the air felt thick, as if the stone had been breathing slowly and deep for centuries. My light scattered across walls, glittering with maker flakes, winking like frost. That's when I heard it, soft, low, almost buried under the trickle of water. At first, it was like the sigh of the sump behind me. Then it shaped itself into something closer to words, slipping through the stone the way cold seeps into bone. It came in fragments, pauses stretching so long between them I thought it had stopped. My name, or almost my name. Not quite right, as if someone else had been practicing it for a while and never got the rhythm right. I stood there, head tilted, trying to catch the source, but the sound didn't behave like an echo. It swelled when I shifted my weight, sank to a murmur when I stood still. I told myself it was air moving through the rock, a siphon breathing between chambers. But the words, if that's what they were, had the uneven cadence of a human whisper. I crouched, tracing my light along cracks in the wall. Each time I moved the beam, the whisper rose and fell in a way that didn't match any airflow I'd ever heard. When I finally decided to head back, I slid into the sump feet first, pushing my pack ahead of me. The water gripped my chest again. That same crushing cold. Halfway through, the straps caught under the lip of rock. I kicked lightly, twisting, but the snag held. That's when the whisper changed. It didn't rise into a shout or turn frantic. It simply stretched into a long, patient hush that matched the pace of my own heartbeat. I froze, holding my breath, trying to tell myself it was just the sound of water around my ears. But the whisper didn't fade when I stopped breathing. It only shifted when I turned my helmet light off, plunging the sump into black. The darkness seemed to pull the sound closer until it was as intimate as breath on my neck. I worked the strap free with slow, deliberate motions, Every scrape of nylon over stone felt loud. On the other side, I hauled myself into the crawl, dripping and shivering. The whisper was quieter here, muffled as if the sump itself had been its mouth. The crawl back to daylight felt longer than before. My light bounced ahead, carving the path in narrow cones. The sound of the creek outside reached me before I saw the pale glow of the entrance. That should have been a relief, but the steady rhythm of water over stone only reminded me of the way the whisper had ebbed and flowed. I crawled out into the damp leaf litter and sat there for a long time, helmet off, staring back into the low black mouth. My breathing felt too loud in the open air. I half expected the whisper to follow, carried by whatever thin wind threaded through the ridge. When I finally stood and started back down the overgrown road, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest was quiet except for the faint creak noise, but now and then the breeze in the trees seemed to break into uneven syllables, the kind that don't quite form words until you think about them too much. I've been in plenty of caves since, some with squeezes tighter than that sump, some with air currents stranger than I can explain, but I haven't gone back there. The map still sits folded in my gear bin, a faint water stain blooming across the corner near the sump's mark. Every now and then, I think I hear a faint hiss when I pick it up, like paper soaking under a slow drip. I tell myself it's just the sound of memory, reshaping itself to fit the dark. Story 2. Markers that moved behind me. We started early because the cave didn't like latecomers. Not that a place of stone and water really has preferences, but there are some caves where the air changes after a certain hour, and not in a way you want to be around for. This one was like that. I'd been in it twice before with other people, but today it was just me and Tom. We had enough flagging tape to lay a bright breadcrumb trail out and back, and a plan to push a side branch that hadn't been surveyed in years. The entrance was a crack halfway up a slope, a black seam framed by briars. Cold air leaked out steady as a whisper, smelling of wet rock and old leaves. Inside, the first chamber was tall enough to stand in, but the walls were close, rough enough to scrape a shoulder if you weren't careful. Our breath fogged in the beams of our headlamps, and the sound of water came from somewhere deeper, that slow, hollow drip caves make when they're thinking. We tied our first tape at the first fork. Tom's knot was quick and loose, with a little slant to the tail the way he always tied them. I took the next junction and tied mine with the long tail I've used since I was a kid. The tape glowed faint pink against the grey limestone, a reassuring little sign that someone had been here on purpose. We kept moving, slow and methodical, stopping at each branch to secure another strip. The third junction stopped me cold. There was already tape there, same colour, same width, same weathered fray at the end. I bent close, running my fingers over the knot. It wasn't just similar, it was one of ours. The tail had the same little curl mine did when I pulled it tight with gloves on. We laughed it off because you have to laugh at something like that or it'll sit on your chest. Tom said maybe another team had come in through a different entrance and was looping around toward us. That would have meant voices, scuffs, echoes of movement. We'd heard nothing but the steady, patient breathing of the cave. The passage narrowed ahead until we were crawling, knees grinding over quartz sand. The sound of my pads squealed in the stillness. My light caught motes of silt hanging in the air, moving just enough to prove time was still passing down here. When we stopped to check our position, I turned my head and froze. A strip of tape was hanging there behind us. It wasn't there before. I knew because I'd been the last to pass that point, and I'd been staring back down the tunnel while Tom checked his compass. It hung loose from a fresh knot, one of mine. I could see the long tail brushing the wall in the faint movement of air. From then on, I started checking every knot we passed. The slant in Tom's, the tail in mine. They were all there. Our own trail was reappearing behind us, closer each time, like the cave was rolling it back in to push us out faster than we'd come in. Tom said maybe the breeze could move them, carry a loose knot backward, but I asked him if a draft could tie a square knot in pink nylon. We picked up the pace, deciding we'd pushed far enough for one day. The deeper we went in, the more the air felt like it was carrying weight, as if someone had wrung the oxygen out of it. My shoulders ached from the crawl, and the sound of our own breathing got loud in the helmet. At one junction we came to 2 strips, both ours, tied to opposite walls. One was from earlier on the trip in, the other should have been somewhere ahead of us, not here. It felt like walking through a book where the pages had been shuffled, where scenes repeated before they should. The tape led us toward what we thought was the exit route. The air seemed fresher that way, carrying the faint scent of outside. We followed the glow of each strip until the tunnel widened into a chamber I didn't recognize. My stomach turned when I realized why. The tape ended at a blank wall, just a flat expanse of peeled limestone, the pale grey matching the color of my hands in the lamplight. No crack, no crawl, no way forward. I ran my fingers over it, half expecting it to flex like skin. It was cold and dry, as if it had been waiting a long time to meet us. Tom swore under his breath, swinging his light in arcs. No entrance, no slope up toward daylight, nothing. We turned back, but the way behind us looked wrong too. Walls slanting in new ways, shadows where there hadn't been shadows. I called out, not expecting an answer, but my voice came back doubled, softer the second time, like someone repeating me from just out of sight. We switched off our lights to conserve battery, then on again in unison. The walls stayed the same, but the tape, what little we could see, was further away now, pulled back into the dark. I didn't say anything, and neither did Tom, but we both started moving faster, our knees knocking rock in the crawl. Eventually, after more turns than I can remember, we stumbled into a low passage I did recognize. A flat stretch with water pooled ankle deep, the faint trickle of it running toward the entrance. We didn't stop to check the knots anymore. The tape hung limp along the way, not fluttering now, as if the cave had given up on trying to help us leave. We crawled out into the cold afternoon air, gasping like we'd been holding our breath for hours. The slope down to the truck looked steeper than it had that morning. Neither of us spoke on the drive out. I kept feeling the texture of nylon under my fingertips, the bite of the knot when it's cinched tight. That night, when I dumped my gear, I found 3 strips of pink tape in my pack. They were knotted the way I tie them, the tails curled just like mine. I hadn't put them there. Tom swears he didn't either. I keep them in a drawer now, and sometimes I think they're shorter than before, like the knots are pulling tighter on their own. I haven't been back to that cave, and I don't plan to, but I still wonder about the wall, whether it was always there, waiting for us, or whether the cave made it just for that moment, when it wanted us to understand that getting in and getting out aren't always the same thing. Story 3. Wind. That counted my steps. I'd been told by older cavers, the kind who've been underground long enough to know what's worth noticing, that you can read a cave by its breath. It's just moving air to most people, but if you stand still long enough, you can tell when the cave's lungs are filling and when they're empty. Some say it's all barometric pressure, the outside air pushing in or out, nothing more than the earth equalizing itself. But some of those same old hands also tell you to pay attention when the wind starts to keep rhythm with your steps. That night, the entrance breathed warm against us, like walking past the muzzle of a sleeping animal. The woods above were already dark, but the warmth in that first draft said the inside was deeper than we'd walk in one trip. It was me and Denny. We'd been pushing side passages all week, most of them pinched out or looped back, but he'd marked one on his survey map with a little arrow and question mark in the margin. That was enough to bring us back. The first hour was easy, bent over walking, a few knee-high crawls. The air stayed warm, not unpleasant, just enough to make your skin damp. Somewhere after the second hour, the wind began to count. I didn't notice it right away. My mind was on the rhythm of my boots on the stone, the occasional slap of my palm when I braced against the wall. Then I realized, every 30 paces without fail, the air would rise just enough to touch my cheeks, then fall away to stillness. 30 more, another touch. Like the cave was marking time with us. We came into a chamber the survey guys had called the organ loft, a tall, narrow room with walls draped in flowstone. When you spoke, the sound didn't bounce back the way it should. It softened, like the stone had been covered in heavy curtains. Denny stopped to scrape away a flaking carbide mark, the kind left decades ago by someone with more nerve than sense. I kept moving, thinking I'd let the breeze do the counting for me since my own nerves had been worn down by hours in the dark. I hit 30 paces and stopped, waiting for the next faint push of air. Nothing came. I turned back, expecting to see the cone of Denny's light cutting through the dust. He wasn't there. My first thought was that he ducked into one of the side fissures to check something. The loft is ringed with them, narrow cracks only a shoulder wide, each one disappearing into blackness like a throat. I called his name, keeping my light low to save battery. The answer came, not in his voice, but in the wind. It pushed from one fissure, short bursts like someone testing how far they could blow without breaking into a laugh. I stood there longer than I should have, my mind struggling to fit it into something harmless. Maybe it was air shifting between levels, finding the path of least resistance. I stepped toward the fissure, put my palm flat to the rock. It was warm. That doesn't happen this deep. Down here, the stone is cold year-round, steady as a tomb. I leaned closer, enough to let the edge of the crack frame my helmet. The wind changed. It didn't come in little gusts anymore. It exhaled once, long and slow, with enough force to bend the short hair on my forehead. Somewhere in that breath, carried low and soft, I heard a number. Just one. A number I didn't want to hear again. I jerked back, light swinging across the loft. The other fissures stared back, black and patient. I called for Denny again, this time louder, the kind of call you can't mistake for casual. Nothing. I stepped to the next fissure, then the next, peering in, listening. Some were dead air. One had a faint inward pull, like a hidden lung drawing me in. I forced myself back to the center of the loft, trying to remember exactly which way we'd entered. My 30-pace count had been broken, and with it went my sense of distance. I chose the widest passage and started walking fast. Every sound seemed too close. My boots, the drip of water, the small patter of dust dislodged somewhere above. I was 30 paces in before the wind returned, brushing my face. I counted again, willing it to stay steady, but the intervals shrank. 25, 20, 15, until it felt like the breath was keeping pace with my own, matching each exhale I made. I caught movement ahead, light bouncing off rock, and I thought I had him. I called out. The light didn't stop. It slid sideways into a fissure and was gone. I ran then, scraping my shoulder on the wall, boots slipping on wet stone. I didn't stop until the passage widened again. I was alone. No sound but the pulse in my ears. I sat down, switched off my lamp, and let the dark press in. The wind kept moving, slow now, shifting from one side of the chamber to the other. It felt like it was circling, testing. I turned the light back on and picked the direction that smelled faintly of outside. Less mineral, more leaf mold. The passages all looked the same now. Even the floor felt different, less worn. The wind's counting started again. 30 steady paces this time, like it had forgiven me for breaking the rhythm. I didn't question it. I followed, grateful for any guide. The air cooled as I moved, and I thought maybe I'd broken into a section closer to the entrance. Then I saw him, or thought I did. Far ahead, the beam of a light, steady and low. I called again. This time, a voice came back, but it was wrong. Too level, no effort in it, like the sound had been shaped and let go without passing through lungs. The light stayed still until I was almost on it, and then it blinked out, leaving me in the dark with only the sound of my own breathing. The wind rose again, a single long breath that seemed to pass right through me. When I found the entrance, the air outside was colder than I remembered. The woods were quiet, too quiet for that hour. I stood there for a long time, light off, letting my eyes adjust, listening for the sound of someone following. Nothing came. The warm breath of the cave had gone still, like it had closed its mouth. Denny didn't come out that night. We went back with a team the next day, flagged every turn, marked every junction. We found the loft, found his pack sitting in the center of it, lamp still clipped to the strap, battery dead. None of the fissures looked disturbed, none of the passages past them showed signs of recent travel. We brought the pack out, but not him. Sometimes, on cool evenings, I'll walk past that slope in the woods and feel a faint warmth on my face, 30 paces from where the rock splits open. I don't go back inside. The cave knows my count now, and I'm afraid if I give it another number, it'll keep it. Story 4. Bones in the tourist lights. I'd heard about the place from a guy who'd worked summers there back in the late 80s before it shut down. Said it used to draw families off the county road, kids clutching paper cups of pink spun sugar from the gift shop, parents squinting at faded brochures. It had been shuttered for years, locked behind a chain-link gate, but the landowner still kept the keys. I tracked him down, a wiry man with a face like a dry creek bed, who jingled his keyring like he wanted me to hear how many doors he had the right to open. Tourists stopped coming, he told me, leaning on the hood of his truck. Wasn't worth the power bill to keep the lights on. I didn't believe that. Places don't get locked that tight just because people lose interest. He let me in one grey morning in late October, the kind where the air smells like the inside of a wet paper bag. The gate screamed when it swung open. The gift shop sat low against the slope, windows clouded with years of dust. Inside, the smell was the first thing that hit me, damp and sweet, like cotton candy left in the rain. Shelves still held mugs with the cave's name stamped in flaking gold, and the counter had a little bell with a tarnished top. My boots left prints in the dust. It felt like stepping into a room that was still waiting for someone to come back. The path started wide and gentle, lined with handrails gone slick with rust. The old tourist signs were still there, bolted to the stone. Lover's Arch in curling red letters, blanket falls under a cartoon of blue ribbons. My headlamp cut across the walls, catching glints where moisture still clung. In the deeper sections, my breath began to cloud. The rails followed the slope down, looping between limestone folds until the air turned still enough to press against my ears. At the bottom was the largest chamber, the one they used to end tours with. The breaker box was still mounted on the wall, its switches labelled in neat black letters. I flipped the one marked main, half expecting nothing. But the overhead floodlights stuttered, then flared, bathing the far wall in bright, flat light. The chamber changed under it, shadows vanished, colours leached away. The rock turned into a pale stage backdrop. That's when I saw them. A pile on a flat rock shelf, long-legged and delicate, white as chalk. At first I thought it was just bat remains, the kind you sometimes find under roosts where owls have been feeding. But these weren't scattered, they were arranged, each bone laid with an odd precision, stacked in a way that suggested deliberate hands, femurs balanced over ribs, skulls angled to face outward. the kind of symmetry that doesn't happen by accident. The lights hummed overhead, a soft electrical buzz. Then I noticed something else, a second note, lower, as if the hum had an echo. I walked to the breaker and threw the switch off. The overhead light died, but the second hum didn't. If anything, it grew sharper, like it wanted me to know it was separate from the wiring. It rose just enough to find that frequency in my teeth, the one that makes you want to grind them together. I turned on my headlamp. The beam swung over the bone pile and caught a detail I'd missed before. The rock around the bones was clean, too clean. No dust, no bat droppings, no grit, just a pale ring marking where the pile sat. Everywhere else in the chamber had the same thin coat of fine dust you get after years without sweeping. It was as if the bones had been lifted away, the rock wiped bare, and then set back down exactly where they'd been. The owner's words came back to me. He'd said he closed the place because people stopped coming. But the way he'd said it, eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, hadn't sounded like the whole truth. I started wondering if maybe he'd shut the doors because something here preferred a smaller audience, or no audience at all. I stood there longer than I should have, my light fixed on that perfect circle of clean rock. My ears strained against the hum. It wasn't constant anymore. It swelled and faded like breath, or like someone walking slow circles just beyond the edge of my light. I told myself it was the air system, though the ducts overhead were rusted shut. Finally, I decided to go. I switched the breaker off again, though the hum stayed, and made my way back up the path. The rails felt colder now, almost damp under my hands. Each step away from the chamber made the hum fade, until I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. The gift shop was dim in the overcast daylight. I stepped behind the counter to leave the key on the register, and that's when the bell rang. One sharp chime, the kind you get when someone taps it with the edge of their finger. I froze. No door had opened. The air didn't stir. I waited for another sound, but the room was still. The dust where I'd walked in earlier was unbroken, except for my own tracks and one new mark. A shallow groove in the layer on the counter, as if a fingertip had been dragged toward the bell. I left the key where it was and stepped outside, closing the door without looking back. The lock clicked easily, like it was glad to be set again. The owner wasn't there. His truck was gone. I walked to my car and sat for a moment, watching the low shape of the building. From that angle, the gift shop's windows caught no light, just black rectangles against the wood. I thought about the bones in the floodlights, the clean ring around them, and the hum that hadn't belonged to any wiring. Driving away, I realized I hadn't touched the steering wheel with my left hand since leaving the chamber. That was the hand I'd used to trace the clean rock circle. It still felt warm, like it had been pressed to a light bulb that never pooled. I flexed my fingers, but the warmth stayed deep in the palm, as if something had marked me there. Didn't stop until I was 2 towns over, and even then I didn't look at my hand in the daylight. I've kept away from that county road since. Every so often I'll hear a hum in a place it doesn't belong, a motel hallway, a basement, the back corner of a library, and I'll feel that same heat bloom in my palm. I try not to think about what might be arranging bones for an empty room, or what it might do when someone finally stops to watch. I think the owner knew, and that's why he let the place sit and rot instead of selling it. Sometimes I imagine the breaker still works, the floodlights still flare to life, and the bone pile sits waiting under their glow. And maybe, if the hum feels like it's being ignored for too long, the arrangement changes, just a little, so the next person will notice. I tell myself I'm better off not knowing what shape it might take next, or who it might be meant for. Story 5. The rope that tightened up. We'd been in that cave twice before. and I'd never liked the way the air hung heavy around the entrance. You could smell the iron in the rock before you even saw the first drop, and there was always a dampness that reminded me of the fog that settles in low creek beds in October, thick enough to muffle your voice. The plan was simple: rig the 30-foot drop, explore the lower chamber, come back the same way. Nothing in that sounded complicated, and the bolt line at the lip, though older than me, was solid. We checked it twice. I was last on rope, partly because I was carrying the extra pack, and partly because I'd always been slower to commit to a free drop. The others went ahead, their voices fading into the chamber below. When I clipped in and eased over the lip, the smell hit me harder. Wet pennies, the copper tang of rock that's been bleeding water for longer than you've been alive. I paid out rope slow, letting the sheath rasp over my descender, that familiar sound steady in my ears. About halfway down, I felt the rope grow heavier in my hand, like someone had just clipped in above me. I told myself it was standard fear, the way your body finds excuses to shake when there's no reason. Still, the weight didn't go away. It shifted. A gentle little tug, polite, the kind you give a friend to ask if they're okay. I froze, boots braced against the wall, my headlamp beams scattering through the floating dust. I looked up, nothing but my own light reflecting back, catching motes that spun like they had all the time in the world. I looked down and saw the faintest scuff of fresh mud on the wall at toe height, the kind you get when someone braces there just long enough to leave their mark. The others were at the bottom, their lamps pointed away to protect my night vision, but I could see the shake in their beams. That told me more than anything they might have said. When my boots finally touched gravel, the rope that had been taut above me went slack all at once, like a held breath let go. We pulled it down to re-rig, and the end came frayed in a way I didn't like. Worse, there was a knot in it I didn't recognize, tight, clean, and wrong. I've been tying lines my whole life, and this one didn't match anything I knew. It looked like it remembered a different set of hands. We didn't talk much after that, just rigged the backup and moved on, but my mind stayed wrapped around that moment when the rope tightened. It wasn't the pull of loose rock or the sway of my own weight. It had felt intentional, measured, the kind of thing you only do if you know the person on the line will feel it. In the lower chamber, the fog from above had settled into a low mist that clung to the floor. Our lamps made halos in it, light bending strangely like it was catching on something unseen. Every sound was dampened, the shuffle of boots, the clink of carabiners. I kept glancing at the rope where it disappeared upward, half expecting to see a shadow moving above. We explored the side passages, found the usual signs of water carving its patient routes through the rock. But in one narrow crawl, I found another mark that didn't belong. A smear of mud on the ceiling in a place too high for anyone lying prone to have touched. The others brushed it off as old caver graffiti, but it was fresh, dark, wet, still smelling faintly of the surface. When it was time to ascend, I volunteered to go second, not wanting to be last again. The rope felt normal under my hands until I reached the halfway point. Then came that same subtle shift in weight. Not a snag, not slack, just the sensation that someone above was holding the line in their hands, feeding it to me in deliberate increments. My heart pounded in my ears, but I didn't stop. I climbed faster, and the feeling eased only when my helmet crested the lip. The last man up was quiet afterward, but I noticed the way he kept flexing his fingers, rubbing them against his palm like he was remembering the feel of something. None of us said the word pulled, but it was there between us, hanging heavier than the air in the pit. Back at the trucks, I examined the knot again. It was still tight, impossible to loosen without cutting. The weave of it was strange, somewhere between a figure 8 and a bowline, but with a twist I couldn't replicate even after staring at it for an hour. It was the kind of knot you might see in an old book, the kind that's fallen out of use because it takes longer to tie than it's worth. But this one had been tied fast and clean. Over the next week, I kept catching myself thinking about that polite little tug on the line. There was nothing aggressive in it. It was more like an acknowledgement, a signal passed between hands on the same rope. The thought settled into my bones in a way I didn't like, that maybe it hadn't meant harm. Maybe it had just wanted me to know it was there. I still have the piece of rope we cut that day. The knot is as tight as ever, the frayed end sealed with the dirt of that pit. Sometimes, late at night, I'll take it out of the drawer and hold it, feeling the shape of it under my fingers. I've caught myself almost tugging on it, the way you might test a line to see if someone's clipped in above you. And every time, I stop, because I'm afraid of what might answer back. Story 6. Church Bells Under the Rock. I'd walked past that hollow 100 times without thinking about it, the way you stop seeing something that's always been there. It sits behind the old whitewashed church, down a slope of brittle grass and knotweed, a dark mouth in the ground that never learned to speak. Folks say when the rain comes hard, the cemetery drains into it, that coffins float loose, that names carved in marble find their way underground. Most people treat it like a superstition worth respecting, the kind you don't challenge. But I'd been walking that way after weeks without rain, when the earth had gone hard and the air felt too still. I told myself it was just a hole, and I went in. The first drop was a short scramble over damp limestone, the edges worn smooth by years of trickle. My light caught pale roots hanging from the ceiling like dead nerves, their tips curling where they dried in the air. The first chamber opened wide enough to stand, and that's when I smelled it. Not the rot of a wet sinkhole, but a faint sweetness, like flowers that had been left too long in water. It was the kind of scent you'd expect in a funeral parlor that hadn't been opened in a while, layered with something that made the back of my throat ache. A crawl led out the far side, low enough to scrape the back of my jacket. The stone pressed close overhead, my lamp beam bouncing from wall to wall until the passage suddenly let out into another room. My light stumbled over the shapes before I realized what I was looking at. Rows of small clay figures, each no taller than my hand, cones with rounded tops, pressed all over with fingerprints. They stood in neat lines facing a blank wall, like a congregation waiting for someone to speak. I took a step forward, and somewhere far below, a sound rose up through the stone. It was faint at first, thin and metallic, like a bell rung underwater. My mind reached for an explanation. Sunday practice, though it was Thursday, and I hadn't seen a soul up top. The sound came again, closer now, the tone sharper, and I realized it didn't quite match the pitch of any church bell I'd ever heard. I told myself it could be something else. Chains shifting, metal tags on coffins nudged by unseen water. I tried to believe it, but my skin didn't. I crouched to look at one of the figures, noticing the way the clay was still damp, the edges soft as if they'd been shaped not long ago. My knee brushed one, and it tipped over silently, leaving behind the exact imprint of its base in the stone floor. Perfect, sharp, and new. The bell sound came again, this time not from below but from somewhere behind the wall the figures faced. It was longer, a sustained ring that wavered at the end, like someone's hand had slipped. My light stayed fixed on that blank wall, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it wasn't a wall at all, just the thinnest layer between me and something else. I backed toward the crawl, careful not to knock any more of the figures over. The sweetness in the air had thickened, and with it came another scent underneath. Wet soil, the kind that clings to wood and cloth when it's been buried too long. As I slid back into the narrow passage, my boot caught on a small ridge of stone, and for a second the weight of the earth above me felt heavier than it should. When I reached the first chamber, I killed my light and stood in the dark. The bell rang again, clearer now, no water between us. I realized it wasn't coming from deep in the cave anymore, it was overhead. The sound was muffled, but the vibration carried through the stone into the soles of my boots. It struck me that if the cemetery really did drain into this hollow, then maybe the bell wasn't tied to any church steeple. I scrambled up the entrance slope faster than I'd meant to, my hands finding holds without thinking. The light outside was dull, the sky a low blanket of grey. I turned toward the churchyard and stopped. It looked the same in every ordinary way. Rows of stones, the white steeple above, but I noticed, in the flat light, that every headstone leaned just a little toward the hollow. Not much, just enough that if you lined them up in your mind, their tilt would meet down where I'd just been standing. The air was colder than when I'd gone in. I started back toward the road, but halfway there I heard it again, faint and far away. The same metallic note, only this time I couldn't tell if it was ahead of me or behind. My hand brushed the back of my jacket, feeling the thin smear of clay where I'd scraped against the figures. It was still damp. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if anything had followed me out. That night I dreamed of the chamber. I saw the rows of clay figures in sharper detail than when I'd been there, the uneven press of fingers, the tiny ridges where someone had pinched the tops. In the dream, the blank wall behind them breathed, pulling the sweetness of the air toward it and exhaling something colder. The bell rang each time it breathed in, and with each breath, the figures tilted a little closer to me. I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth. In the days after, I kept thinking about that clean imprint the fallen figure had left, how it had been too sharp to be old. I wondered who would crawl down there to shape them, to line them up in such perfect rows. The ground had been bone dry for weeks. There was no mud for miles. So where did the damp clay come from? I never told anyone what I'd seen. In a town that old, some things are better left as stories people only half believe. Still, sometimes on Thursday afternoons when the wind carries right, I hear the faint ring of a bell from that direction. Not the clear chime of the church tower, but the muffled, wavering tone of metal struck in a place where sound doesn't belong. When I hear it, I think about the headstones leaning toward the hollow, about the way the air had thickened around me down there. And I wonder if someday, after the right kind of rain, the earth will open a little wider, and whatever's on the other side of that wall will decide it's time to speak. Story 7. Map ink that wouldn't dry. I'd been staring at that cave map for months, tracing the dotted route with my finger like it was a promise. The survey notes said sump lip, tight approximately 1 body length, then a quick climb into open air. Nothing too bad, at least on paper. I'd driven 3 hours for it. No way was I letting a cold pool turn me back. The entrance was easy to miss, just a dark mouth at the base of a limestone cut where the creek vanished underground. The hillside was choked with laurel, leaves still dripping from an earlier shower, and the air smelled like wet earth and moss. I signed the weatherproof log stashed in a plastic bag by the root wedge, stuffed it back, and adjusted my pack straps. That little ritual always settles me. Name, date, time in. A record for whoever might need to come looking. The first stretch was nothing. Stoop walking through a hallway of rock, my headlamp carving the darkness into dull walls with water streaks and scalloped grooves. Every few steps, a drip hit the back of my neck or the top of my helmet. My boots pressed into silt that gave way like wet flour. Mica flecks caught my beam and flashed like tiny frost patches. I've been in tighter, nastier crawls. This one almost felt welcoming. The sump appeared in the beam like a piece of smoked glass laid over the floor. Still, brown water filled the passage from wall to wall, ceiling low enough I'd have to turn my head sideways to fit. I lay flat, my chest already in the chill, my helmet turned so the light wouldn't catch and scrape. The rock pressed the small of my back from above. That first breath you take before going under feels bigger than your lungs can handle, not just air, but commitment. The cold wrapped me immediately, clamping my ribs and slowing my hands. I shuffled forward, toes pushing against rock, my shoulders finding the shape of the ceiling by touch. The sound of my own breath filled my head, booming in the helmet. I counted 1, 2, 3 shuffles, then felt the rock lift above me. I angled up, broke the surface, and sucked air like I'd been holding my breath longer than I had. The chamber was small, just enough headroom to crouch. The air was thick and warm, smelling of stone and something faintly metallic. My light picked up mica again, tiny silver sparks on the walls. I was just shifting to get comfortable when I heard it. At first I thought it was the sump behind me, that wet, sighing pull you get when water moves through a narrow spot. But there was a rhythm to it, thin threads of sound curling into almost words. When I stayed still, it faded. When I moved, even a knee shift, it thickened again. I've heard caves speak in drafts and echoes before, but this one, it was putting syllables together. My name, broken up like it had learned it from someone else's mouth. I told myself it was the siphon, an echo trick. Still, my skin prickled under my suit. The map showed a bigger passage forward, but something in me didn't want to keep going. I turned back toward the sump. Sliding down into the water, my pack caught on something under the lip. Not a big snag, but enough to hold me. I tried to back up and free it, but the more I twisted, the more stubborn it felt. And in that same moment, the whisper changed. It smoothed out, became steady, almost matching my heartbeat. It didn't get louder, just more certain. I emptied my lungs to shrink myself and get the strap loose. The moment it freed, I heard what sounded like a slow inhale coming from somewhere under the water. Not mine. I told myself it was just the shift of air pressure. I didn't believe it. Halfway through, I did something I still can't explain. I turned my light off. In the dark, the whisper changed pitch. Closer now, right at my ear, as if the rock itself was speaking. My hand brushed the ceiling. My shoulder scraped. I felt like something else was in there with me, not touching, just close enough to be known. My toes found the slope up, and I rose too fast, smacking my helmet on the ceiling before my head broke the surface. The water on this side looked darker, colder. I stood on the ledge, breathing hard. The whisper didn't follow. It stayed under, patient. I moved on. The tunnel back felt different. My boot prints were still fresh in the silt, but the air seemed cooler. I passed a spot where the ceiling dripped in perfect rhythm. For a second, I thought it was repeating that sound I'd heard. I didn't stop to listen. At the entrance, I signed the log again. My second entry looked shakier than the first. Outside, it was near dusk. The woods were too quiet. No insects, no wind. Just that waiting kind of stillness. I could feel the sump's cold still inside me as I hiked back to the road, like it had settled in deeper than my skin. That night, I couldn't get it out of my head. Every faint noise, the fridge cycling, the bathroom fan, a car rolling past, had that same underthread. Not loud, not demanding, just patient, waiting for me to listen again. The next weekend, I went back. I told myself it was just to prove the point. Same map, same sump, and this time I'd go forward, find the big chamber, make it a normal trip in my memory. I brought extra rope, spare lights, everything by the book. The woods were just as quiet when I got there, no birds. The creek at the entrance seemed lower, but the air coming out was warmer. I signed in again, name, date, time, and slid into the dark. The sump water was colder this time. I took it slow, counting shuffles. My helmet scraped once, twice. Then the ceiling lifted. I came up into the same cramped chamber, breathing hard, and there it was. The whisper. Same as before, riding the ripples I made. I forced myself to keep moving forward. The next crawl was low, sandy, the grains shifting under my elbows with a sound like distant footsteps. It opened into a room tall enough to stand in. My beam caught old carbide marks on the wall, dates scratched by hands decades gone. In the sand at my feet was a half-collapsed name, the letters rounded off by time. I crouched, brushed my fingers over it. The sand seemed to hold the print of my hand longer than it should. The whisper didn't come through here. Instead, I heard a drip, one steady point of water falling into a pool somewhere ahead. I followed it through another low crawl and into the big room the map had promised. The ceiling soared up like the inside of a split geode, stone drapes hanging along one wall. Water trickled down into a shallow basin of sand. Another name was written there, clearer, fresher. The date was only a year ago. That's when I felt the draft. Warm air brushing past my face, then cooling again in a slow, repeating cycle. I switched my light off, thinking maybe I'd hear it better. The dark came down like a lid. First came the sound of my own body, blood in my ears, the creak of gear straps, breath. Then under that something else, not the sump whisper, not water, something moving in time with the warm air. I snapped the light back on. The room looked the same, the basin, the drapes, the far wall with its black seams. But now there was a single wet footprint in the sand beside mine. I didn't go deeper. I turned and headed back, faster than before. The crawl seemed narrower, the sand noisier. When I reached the sump, the water was perfectly still. My light made my reflection in it look like another caver waiting below. I lay down, took one long breath, and went under. Halfway through, the strap caught again. This time, it felt like a hand holding it. Not hard, just enough to make me stop. Something pressed lightly against my boot, like a partner giving the signal to push. I didn't think. I shoved forward, felt the strap release, and kicked hard until I broke the surface. On the entrance side, I stood dripping on the ledge. Light pointed at the sump. The water stayed calm. No ripple, no sound, just that tea-brown stillness. I got out fast, signed the log, hiked to the road. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following through the laurel. I haven't gone back a third time, but sometimes, when it's quiet in the house, I'll catch myself holding still just to listen. And in the stillness, under the hum of the fridge or the distant cars, there's something steady, not loud, not insistent, just patient, like it remembers my name.